The date is July 17th, 1945. The air over Potsdam smells of wet brick and torn Europe, and a new president wears an old war like an oversized uniform. Voices of the victorious powers echo through the villas of Cecilienhof as a man from Missouri learns to arrange the world in cool syllables. His name is Harry S. Truman, and in his pockets lie notes harder than the handshakes around the table. The thunder from Berlin has not fully died. Yet another tone already moves through the corridors, drier, sharper, without pathos. What changes when a new president arrives while the fronts are still warm? Truman steps into a room that Franklin D. Roosevelt had furnished in soft colors, and he moves the chairs closer to the table. A telegram on April 12th, 1945, had pushed him from nowhere into the Oval Office, and from that day, he learns in gasps the map, the files, the names, the tone that counts. The handover is brief, the world situation over-complex, and Truman keeps returning to a memorandum as dry as a balance sheet. It declares a line that compresses into 4 words: firm, predictable, without illusions. Roosevelt had nursed with Stalin at Yalta a language that tolerated hints and left a blue patch in the post-war sky. Truman wants morning haze and visibility ranges instead, explicit, measurable, without warm metaphors. By July 17, 1945, as he heads for Potsdam, his government mind has already shifted gears. James F. Burns, his Secretary of State, arranges positions like calculations, and between the pages sits a quiet certainty that pressure works better than pleading. Why this matters now? Because security architecture is not built from feelings but from signals. Potsdam shows that signal strength begins when knowledge of a capability changes a conversation before the words are spoken. What does power smell like when it has just been invented? On July 16, 1945, in the desert of New Mexico, a light outruns the night, and its name is Trinity. Truman carries the message of success in his briefcase when he takes Stalin's hand. He mentions a new weapon lightly, as if speaking of an improved toolbox and not of a hinge for the century. Stalin nods, eyes calm, as if he expected it, saying only that he is glad of American progress. For Truman, those seconds changed the balance of words. Where windows for compromise once stood, he now sees frames for conditions. It is the beginning of a logic that does not shout, but calculates. If A, then B; if no clarity, then power projection; if ambiguity, then plain speak. Why this matters now? Because technology policy is foreign policy, when the device becomes a sentence. And once a device becomes a sentence, alliances are rewritten in the grammar of capability. How do you know a conference is not an epilogue, but a prologue? Delegations arrive between July 17th and August 3rd, 1945, and each date pours a thin layer of concrete over the old world. Cecilienhof looks quiet, but its rooms are full of tables and columns of numbers. They settle on 5 Ds for Germany's future: demilitarization, denazification, democratization, decentralization, and dismantling. They fix the occupation zones, clarify the framework of reparations, and shift Poland's border to the Oder and the Neisse. On paper, these points sound like administrative acts. In reality, they form the zipper of a continent that will never close again without teeth. Truman negotiates tightly, avoiding flourishes and preferring endpoints. Stalin wants security through influence. Truman offers order through rules, and the difference sets a temperature that soon will be called cold. On July 26, 1945, the Potsdam Declaration to Japan is published with a clear staging of ultimatum and outcome. It is the same voice that will echo in dealings with Moscow, define the aims, and shorten the path. Why this matters now? Because institutions outlast moods when their procedures are visible. Potsdam teaches that durable order is engineered in checkable steps, not performed in grand phrases. Why does a change of government in London alter the room's pitch? On July 26, 1945, Britain's wartime miracle ends on paper, and Winston Churchill leaves the table. Clement Attlee sits down. Ernest Bevin soon takes foreign affairs, and the British tone shifts from myth to management. It looks sober, and it suits Truman. Where Churchill wielded rhetoric like a sword, Attlee prefers administrative steel. From that moment, the Western camp appears less a chorus of veterans and more a workshop of planners. The conference loses drama, but gains a kind of surgical precision.
Between notes and pauses, big words become small conditions, and small conditions are the molecules of long orders. Why this matters now? Because continuity in foreign policy grows not from faces, but from routines. Procedures keep the score steady across leadership changes if the score is written clearly. What did hardness toward Moscow mean in the summer of 1945? Hardness is just a word, unless translated into mechanisms. For Truman, it means putting times on promises and yardsticks on neighbors. Reparations are allowed by extraction inside the Soviet zone, but cross flows into the Western zones are tied to counter values. It is economics as fencing, unspectacular but load-bearing. The Allies create a council of foreign ministers to prepare peace treaties in sequence. The subtext writes a double line. Cooperation is possible as long as it is measurable, and measurability ends where influence goes invisible. Truman reminds his aides of JCS 1067, the U.S. directive for Germany that since April 1945 limits the rebound of heavy industry. Whoever narrows capacities, narrows options, and whoever narrows options, narrows adventures. The Soviet leadership reads in this logic a method of freezing that tries to sum Moscow's security in numbers. But security on open ledgers looks in Moscow like a mirror that only returns its own scar. Why this matters now? Because policy without metrics becomes hope in costume. When stakes are continental, only yardsticks can carry the weight of promises. How do you negotiate with a memory just fought to the end? Stalin arrives with the capital of victory, with armies at Berlin, and a people that paid the unimaginable. His political vocabulary in 1945 consists of depth, buffer, and control. Truman stresses procedure, organs, and transparency instead. He wants every promise to have a number and every meeting a deadline. Two rationalities collide. One wants certainty as space, and one wants certainty as rules. Between them rises what later will be cataloged as block formation. It does not come from one loud dispute, but from a sum of small disagreements. It is the quiet arithmetic of diverging needs that hardens into borders you can feel. Why this matters now? Because conflicts rarely escalate on a single sentence, but on the accumulation of soft differences. To design order today is to catch those soft differences before they bend the architecture. What is the role of the invisible when everyone stares at the tables? In 1945, the invisible is science, and it hides inside the files. With Trinity, research becomes politics, and politics becomes the geometry of power. In Potsdam, Truman tests not only phrases, but reactions. His remark to Stalin about the new weapon is not bragging, it is a thermometer. The reply is cooler than many in Washington expected, and therefore it changes the feel of the scale. If the counterpart does not startle, the scale must be redrawn. The next weeks proved the scale real. Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Japan's capitulation on August 15, 1945. The weapon ends a war but begins a ledger, and ledgers have a way of returning. Why this matters now? Because capabilities speak even when diplomats whisper. Strategy that ignores the device will be rewritten by it, usually on harsher terms. How do you write order into a city built of ruins? Potsdam decides what Germany may be and, more importantly, what it may not be. The untangling of industrial cartels, the removal of Nazi personnel, the encouragement of local self-government are set in motion. It sounds technical, yet technique is the grammar of power. Whoever writes precise rules builds bridges that even rivals must later cross because they hold. Truman's hardness is not a drum, but a consequence. He offers cooperation, but he edges it with conditions. The Soviet side answers with building inside its zone, land reform, nationalization, a security apparatus. Both sides call it stabilization. Both measure it in different units. So a parallel logic appears that is not yet called enmity. It is the shadow in which alliances will soon take shape. Why this matters now? Because political grammar shapes the future longer than declarations. Reconstruction that works is framed in rules the adversary respects because they function, not because he likes them. Where does the cold mode begin when the air is still lukewarm? Between July 17th and August 2nd, 1945, lies a field of sentences that will later become quotations. None is dramatic. Together they form the score of a continent. In Potsdam, Truman installs the habit of clarity. In 1946, it will sound across Europe as a new tone, and in 1947, it will be poured into doctrines. The path from conference to conflict does not run through an explosion, but through routine. Meetings, notes, reports, and from each document the same question looks back: what is verifiable? Moscow answers with its own tempo. Spheres of influence are consolidated, connections westward are remeasured, communication grows ritual and spare. Why this matters now? Because routines become rails, and rails guide choices before choices are made. If you care about options, watch the tracks, not the speeches. What does the room sound like when voices sort into camps? In the conference pauses, you hear the rubbing of maps on tables. It is the sound of a world resetting its seam. Truman moves in it like a man who trusts solid tools. He believes in procedures, and procedures are the clamp of politics. Those clamps press the euphoria of victory into the shape of administration. The image that emerges is not warm, but it is sturdy. When autumn sends post-war cold along the streets, it is not only weather, it is the translation of Potsdam into daily life. Why this matters now? Because administration is not the enemy of vision, it is its scaffolding. Without braces, even the best horizon collapses under use. Why is this logic called cold? Because it forgoes pathos and still decides. Because it sees the world as a system of incentives and limits rather than a stage for reconciliation. Truman stands in the line of American pragmatists who test the tool before they write the plan. In Potsdam, he shows how to practice both in one sitting. Stalin's side answers with its own rationality, heavy, patient, range-minded. From the overlay of both emerges a climate that does not know compliments. That climate will color maps, frame treaties, structure armies. It will set the pulse of the news for decades. Why this matters now? Because clear logic is not hostile, it is legible. Legibility is the only language that understands mistrust without belonging to it. Where does the thread of Potsdam lead? It leads into an architecture held by deterrence and procedure. It leads to institutions that slow quarrels and make them manageable. It also leads to borders more rigid than reconciliation would like. And it demands from leaders a patience that elections rarely reward. Potsdam is not a heroic moment, but a sober start. The hardness toward Moscow is not theater, it is structure. Two images remain at the end, Truman with notes in one hand and a newly set voice in the other, and Stalin with the calm of a man who knows how much blood security costs. Between them lies a cold space, furnished with rules, and whoever enters must learn to calculate. Why this matters now? Because calculation is the form in which peace survives when sympathy does not suffice. And because every new crisis quietly asks whether we still understand Potsdam. What remains when the noise of past battles is only dust? What remains is the recognition that a harder language is sometimes the more honest clothing for unavoidable oppositions. And that hardness does not arise from a taste for hardness, but from the duty to hold order against temptation. Truman did not start a war at Potsdam. He chose a method. It was cool and it was consistent. The cool method became the grammar of an era. And grammar, once learned, writes long sentences. In a world fraying at the edges again, this grammar is worth a steady look. It asks us softly whether we prefer to hope or prefer to hold. Perhaps that is the only real choice politics ever has. Are we ready to bear cold logic to avoid hot blood? Or will we let hope speak until it grows too loud to be true